I never imagined I'd find myself in this position, sitting in my father's office at Sullivan Real Estate Development, staring at a family photo that now feels like it belongs to another lifetime. The morning sun streams through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown Boston office, catching the frame of that photo. Dad, Mom, Sarah, and me at Sarah's nursing school graduation, all smiles and hope for the future. 5 years ago, everything seemed so clear. I was 30, following in Dad's footsteps, learning the real estate business from the ground up. Sarah was 27, thriving in her nursing career. We were the picture-perfect Sullivan sisters, or so everyone thought. Emma, Janet, our office manager, pokes her head in. "Your 10 o'clock is here." "Thanks, Janet." I straighten my blazer, trying to focus on the present. But my mind keeps drifting back to the chaos that destroyed our family's facade of perfection. The story I'm about to share still feels surreal, like something from one of those dramatic family movies Sarah and I used to watch together, curled up on my bed with contraband snacks at 2 a.m. Growing up, Sarah and I were inseparable. More than sisters, we were best friends, partners in crime, each other's biggest cheerleaders. The age gap of 3 years meant nothing to us. We shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams, even our elaborate wedding plans. Sarah was determined to have this ethereal spring ceremony with cherry blossoms everywhere. She'd spend hours showing me photos of Japanese gardens, planning every detail. Meanwhile, I dreamed of a winter wonderland wedding, complete with crystal icicles and soft, falling snow. We used to joke that we'd need to space our weddings 6 months apart so we could be each other's maid of honor. Looking back at those innocent plans now makes my chest tight with a mixture of nostalgia and regret. If someone had told me then how everything would unravel, how our perfectly planned futures would shatter like thin ice under unexpected weight, I wouldn't have believed them. Back then, our biggest concern was covering for each other when we wanted to bend our parents' rules. Sarah would claim I was studying at my friend Jennifer's house when I was actually meeting my college boyfriend, who in retrospect was definitely not worth the deception. I'd tell Mom and Dad that Sarah was at the library when she was really at some party. We never got caught. We were that good at maintaining our united front. Engagement. When Sarah got engaged to Mark 3 years ago, it felt like everything was falling into place perfectly. Mark was exactly the kind of guy we'd fantasized about during those late-night sister talks. Brilliant in his IT career, genuinely kind, and completely devoted to Sarah. I remember the day she called me from the hospital where she worked, her voice trembling with excitement. "Emma, he did it. In the hospital garden, right under the cherry trees." She practically squealed into the phone. It was perfect, just like we always planned. I was thrilled when she asked me to be her maid of honor, though we both knew it was never really a question. We threw ourselves into wedding planning with the same enthusiasm we'd had as teenagers. Our shared Pinterest board exploded with ideas: venue options, flower arrangements, color schemes. Sarah was determined to recreate that Japanese garden feeling she'd always dreamed of, and I was determined to help her make it happen. 2 weeks before the wedding. The trouble started exactly 2 weeks before the wedding. We were at Mom's house, surrounded by old photo albums and boxes of memories in the attic. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty window, casting a nostalgic glow over everything as we searched for pictures for the reception slideshow. We wanted to include all those precious moments. Sarah and me in matching Easter dresses, family vacations at Cape Cod, Dad teaching us to ride bikes in the driveway of our old house. The attic was like a time capsule of our childhood, filled with forgotten treasures and dust-covered memories. That's when Sarah found it, a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, tucked away in an old showbox. At first, we thought they were love letters between our parents, maybe from their college days. Sarah started reading one aloud, her voice playful and teasing. "My dearest Catherine," she read, grinning at me. Oh my God, Mom was such a romantic. But her voice trailed off suddenly. I watched as all the color drained from her face, her hands starting to shake as her eyes raced across the yellowed paper. The letters weren't romantic at all. They were from someone named David Cooper, dating back to the time around Sarah's conception. They detailed a forbidden relationship with our mother and his desperate pleas to be part of his unborn child's life. That child was Sarah. "Emma?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. "What? What is this?" I'll never forget the look in her eyes as the truth sank in. It was like watching a mirror shatter. Everything she thought she knew about herself fracturing into 1,000 sharp pieces. Sarah had always been Dad's shadow, following him around his office, learning about property development, dreaming of joining the family business. She'd even gotten her nursing degree with the idea that understanding healthcare facilities would help her in real estate development eventually. The confrontation. What happened next in Mom's kitchen felt like a scene from a movie playing out in slow motion. Sarah burst in, the letters clutched in her trembling hands. Mom was preparing dinner, humming to herself. Such a normal moment about to be shattered forever. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "What are these?" I watched as Mom turned, saw the letters, and literally staggered back against the counter. All the color drained from her face as recognition hit. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle bubbling of whatever was cooking on the stove. Such a mundane, everyday sound, in contrast to the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Sarah, Emma, I." Mom's voice cracked. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Through her tears, the truth finally came out. David Cooper had been her colleague at the accounting firm where she worked before becoming a full-time mom. During a rough patch in her marriage, they had an affair. When she discovered she was pregnant, she chose to stay with Dad, never telling anyone about Sarah's true paternity. "I was young, scared, and stupid," Mom pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Your father and I were going through such a difficult time, but we worked it out. I wanted to protect our family." "Protect us?" Sarah's laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. "By lying to everyone for 27 years? By letting Dad believe, oh God, Dad." Her voice broke on that last word, and I could see the realization hitting her anew. The man she'd idolized her entire life, the man she'd built her future plans around, wasn't actually her father. I tried to step in, to be the voice of reason. "Sarah, maybe we should wait until after the wedding to tell Dad. Give yourself time to process." "Process what, Emma?" Sarah whirled on me, her eyes blazing. "That my entire life has been a lie? That I've been living in some kind of elaborate fantasy? How can I walk down the aisle with Dad next week, knowing this? How can I let him give a father of the bride speech when he's not even?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Looking back now, I wish I'd handled that moment differently. Instead of trying to protect everyone by suggesting we keep the secret longer, I should have supported Sarah's right to the truth. But standing there in our childhood kitchen, watching my sister's world implode, all I could think about was damage control. At Dad's workshop. The next day was a Saturday, and Sarah insisted I come with her to Dad's office. We found him in his private workshop, a converted space in the building's basement where he liked to work on personal projects. He was hunched over his workbench, carefully crafting what we later learned was a handmade jewelry box for Sarah's wedding gift. The sight of him there, completely unaware of how his world was about to change, made my stomach twist into knots. "Daddy?" Sarah's voice was small, like when she was a little girl. The endearment she hadn't used in years made this moment even more heartbreaking. Dad looked up, his face breaking into that warm smile he always had for us. "Hey, sweetie." "Emma, what brings my girls down to the dungeon on a Saturday?" Sarah's hands were shaking so badly that I had to help her hold out the letters. Dad took them, confusion crossing his face as he recognized Mom's name. I watched as he read, seeing the exact moment understanding hit him. He sat heavily on his workbench, the half-finished jewelry box forgotten in his hands. What happened next showed me exactly why Robert Sullivan was the most respected real estate developer in Boston. Even as his personal world crumbled, his first thought was for his daughter's well-being. "Sarah, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his eyes. "I need you to understand something very important. Biology doesn't make a father. Love does. And I have loved you every single day of your life. Nothing, absolutely nothing, will ever change that." He stood up, still holding the unfinished jewelry box. "I'll still walk you down the aisle next week if you want me to. This changes nothing about how I feel about you." But Sarah was already backing away, shaking her head. "I need time," she whispered. I can't. The wedding. I just need time." I watched helplessly as she fled the workshop, leaving Dad and me standing there amid the sawdust and shattered certainties. Dad looked down at the jewelry box in his hands, and for the first time in my life, I saw tears in his eyes. "Should I go after her?" he asked me, his voice rough with emotion. "No, Dad," I said softly, stepping forward to hug him. "Give her some space. She'll come back when she's ready." But even as I said those words, something in my gut told me this was just the beginning of a much longer and more painful journey than any of us could imagine. The search. Sarah's need for time turned into an obsession with finding David Cooper. I watched helplessly as my sister transformed into someone I barely recognized, spending countless hours online, tracking down every possible lead. Her nursing job at Massachusetts General was put on indefinite hold. Her relationship with Mark became strained as wedding plans were suspended indefinitely. When she finally located David through LinkedIn, he was running a successful photography studio in San Francisco. His response to her message was almost instantaneous. Unlike Dad, who had built our real estate empire from scratch and had 2 daughters to focus on, David had never married or had other children. He welcomed Sarah into his life with an enthusiasm that made me uneasy. "Emma, you should see his studio," Sarah gushed during one of our increasingly rare coffee meets. "It's this amazing space in Hayes Valley. And get this, I have his eye color and his love for photography. It all makes sense now." I tried to be supportive, but watching her slip away from our family was like watching a slow-motion car crash. "Sarah, that's great, but don't forget Dad's waiting to hear about rescheduling the wedding. He's still working on that jewelry box. You don't understand him." She cut me off, her eyes taking on that distant look I'd grown to hate. "I'm finally discovering who I really am. Did you know David's mother was an artist? Maybe that's why I've always been drawn to the creative side of things, even while trying to force myself into Dad's business mold." The confrontation. What I consider my unforgivable betrayal happened after Sarah canceled her 3rd Sunday dinner with Dad in a row to have a video call with David. I found her at her apartment, surrounded by old family photos she was digitizing to share with her real father. "This has to stop," I said, my CEO in training voice coming out despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to Dad? The man who sat through every single one of your school plays. Who taught you to drive in that old Volvo? Who stayed up all night helping you prepare for your nursing school interviews?" Sarah's response cut deep. "You don't understand, Emma. You get to be sure about who you are. You're Dad's real daughter. The true Sullivan heir. I've been living a lie my whole life. Every time I look in the mirror now, I wonder what parts of me come from a stranger. The move. Within months of that confrontation, Sarah made her decision. She packed up her life in Boston and moved to San Francisco to be closer to David. The way we found out about her small wedding ceremony in California was like a knife to the heart, through Facebook photos that a mutual friend shared on their timeline. I was in Dad's office when I saw them pop up on my feed. Sarah, radiant in a simple white dress. Cherry blossoms everywhere, just like she'd always dreamed. But instead of Dad walking her down the aisle, it was David Cooper. Mark stood beside her, looking uncomfortable but supportive. The caption read, "A perfect intimate ceremony in Golden Gate Park." Dad tried to maintain his composure when I showed him the photos, but I could see how deeply it wounded him. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, the one he'd worked behind for 30 years while building Sullivan Real Estate Development into what it is today. "Well," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "at least she got her cherry blossoms." He turned back to his computer screen, but I could see his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his reading glasses. The down payment for their house has already been transferred to their account. I've included a note wishing them well. I was speechless. Even after everything, Dad had still given Sarah the wedding gift he'd promised, a substantial down payment for a house. The handcrafted jewelry box sat unfinished on a shelf in his workshop, a painful reminder of what could have been. Growing distance. Over the next few years, my relationship with Sarah dwindled to occasional likes on Instagram and perfunctory holiday texts. Meanwhile, I threw myself into learning every aspect of our family business. Dad needed something to focus on, and teaching me the intricacies of real estate development seemed to help. We had Sunday dinners together every week, and I made sure to include him in every aspect of my life. I even started taking him to property viewings, not because I needed his input anymore, but because I knew how much he enjoyed analyzing potential investments. "You've got good instincts, Emma," he'd say, running his hand along crown molding or checking the foundation of a building. "You see the potential in properties, just like I always have." The diagnosis. 2 years into Sarah's new life in California, I started noticing concerning changes in Dad. At first, they were small things. He'd forget the names of longtime business associates or show up to meetings on the wrong day. Then came the incident that terrified me. He got lost driving to a property he'd owned for 20 years. "Dad," I said gently one evening in his office, after he'd spent 10 minutes looking for a file that was right in front of him, "I think we need to see Dr. Patterson." The diagnosis hit like a wrecking ball to the chest: early onset Alzheimer's. I sat beside Dad in the doctor's sterile office, holding his hand as Dr. Patterson explained the prognosis, treatment options, and what we needed to prepare for. While medication can help slow the progression, Dr. Patterson explained, his voice gentle but firm, we need to start preparing for the future now, while Mr. Sullivan is still clear-minded. That evening, Dad insisted on reviewing his estate plans. In his home office, surrounded by photos of his real estate triumphs and family memories, he made his decisions clear. "I'm making you my power of attorney, Emma," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "And I'm leaving you the bulk of the estate, the company, the properties, my savings." "Dad, no," I protested, thinking of Sarah. "We should split things more evenly. Sarah's still your daughter, regardless of biology." He shook his head, a sad smile playing at his lips. "This isn't about punishing Sarah. It's about responsibility and commitment. You've proven yourself capable of managing these responsibilities. The business, our properties, they need someone who understands them and cares about them. You've shown that you do." The return. Last month, everything changed again. A text message from Sarah lit up my phone during a property showing. "Just heard about Dad's will from Aunt Linda. Can we talk?" Suddenly, My phone was flooded with messages and calls from my sister. Sarah claimed she'd done some soul searching and realized she'd been unfair to both Dad and me. She missed having her sister in her life. She wanted to make things right. But then came the real reason for her sudden reappearance. She started pushing me to convince Dad to change his will while he still could. I deserve an equal share, she argued. He raised me as his daughter for 27 years. The irony of her claiming that relationship now, after rejecting it so thoroughly, wasn't lost on me. Unexpected visit. Last week, Sarah showed up unannounced at my office in the Sullivan Building. Through the glass walls, I watched her approach, designer handbag, perfectly styled hair, looking every bit the successful San Francisco transplant. But something was off. Mark trailed behind her, his usual confident tech guy demeanor replaced by something more hesitant. "Emma," Sarah's voice broke as she entered my office. "I've made a huge mistake. Everything in California. It's not what I thought it would be." She collapsed into one of my client chairs, her carefully maintained facade crumbling. According to her tearful confession, David wasn't the dream father she'd imagined. He was controlling, pressuring her to take over his photography business since she was his only child. Her marriage was struggling, Mark, and she had been secretly separated for months after a massive fight about money. But the real truth came in an unexpected message from David himself that appeared on my laptop during our conversation. His words painted a very different picture of the past few years. Sarah had been pressuring him to sell his studio and invest in what turned out to be a multi-level marketing scheme that Mark had gotten involved with after losing his tech job. When David refused, she'd tried manipulating his sister into convincing him to take out a second mortgage. "Your sister isn't being honest with any of you," David's message read. I should have said something sooner, but I was afraid of losing what little relationship we had left. I looked up from my screen to find Sarah's face had gone pale. Mark had walked to the window, his back to us both. The truth finally spilled out. They were drowning in debt from the MLM scheme. Their perfect California life was a carefully constructed lie, maintained through strategic social media posts, while their reality crumbled around them. The truth emerges. "We're over $100,000 in debt," Sarah finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "The MLM company. They kept promising we were close to breaking through. Just one more investment, one more product package. We maxed out our credit cards, took out personal loans. I tried getting money from David by playing up the whole long-lost daughter thing, but he saw right through it. I sat there, behind Dad's old desk, my desk now, trying to process everything. Part of me felt a deep sympathy for my little sister, clearly in over her head and scared. But another part was furious. She'd been manipulating everyone, playing us all against each other while crafting this fantasy life on Instagram. "The worst part," I finally said, "is that you've been making Dad feel guilty about abandoning you when you were the one who cut him out of your life. And now you only want to reconnect because of the inheritance?" The confession. "You need to tell Dad everything," I said firmly, standing up from behind my desk. "The whole truth, Sarah. About the debt, about lying to David, about Mark's job, all of it." Sarah started making excuses about Dad's condition, about not wanting to upset him, but I cut her off. "Either you tell him, or I will. He deserves the truth, especially from you." We caught Dad on one of his good days in his home office. He was reviewing some old property documents, his mind clear and sharp. Sarah told him everything: the MLM scheme, the mounting debt, the lies to David, the manipulation. Throughout her confession, Dad sat quietly in his leather chair, the one he'd had for over 20 years of making business decisions. When Sarah finally finished, the silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then Dad did something that shocked us both. He started laughing. Not mockingly, but with a kind of warm recognition. You know what this reminds me of, he said, leaning back in his chair. When you were 7, you broke my favorite coffee mug. Instead of just telling me the truth, you spent a week creating this elaborate story about how the dog knocked it over. You even made your teddy bear sign a witness statement. His eyes twinkled with the memory. You've always been like this, Sarah, creating complicated solutions to simple problems, just like your mother. The resolution. After hours of honest conversation, Dad came up with a plan. He would help Sarah and Mark with their debt, but with strict conditions. They needed to move back to Boston, find real jobs, no more MLM schemes, and attend financial counseling. The debt would be paid from his current assets, not the inheritance, and they would need to sign an agreement for reasonable monthly repayments. The inheritance plan stays as is, Dad said firmly. The company and properties go to Emma. She's earned that. But, he added, looking at Sarah, I'm setting up an education trust for your future children. It can only be used for tuition and educational expenses, and it becomes active after you maintain regular contact with me for a year. The relief on Sarah's face was painful to watch. Thank you, Daddy, she whispered, using that old childhood endearment again, but this time it felt genuine. Epilogue. Sarah and Mark found an apartment 10 minutes from Dad's house. It's much smaller than their place in San Francisco, but watching Sarah arrange her few belongings in the modest space, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine contentment. She's working as an office manager at a medical practice now, while Mark landed a position at a local tech firm. They haven't missed a single debt repayment to Dad. The biggest change has been in how we handle Dad's care. Sarah and I created a schedule that works around both our jobs. She takes Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturday mornings. I handle Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sunday afternoons. We alternate Fridays. There's something healing about sharing this responsibility, about working together to care for the man who raised us both. Dad's condition progresses, as expected. The good days are fewer now, though the medication helps. Sometimes he gets confused about which of us is which, or thinks we're both teenagers again. But even on his worst days, there's a peace about him when both his daughters are near. Last month, during one of Dad's clearer moments, he started talking about their old camping trips. Sarah went along with his memories, and later I found her crying in the kitchen. Those trips really happened, Emma, she said, wiping her eyes. I'd forgotten them completely. I spent so much time trying to build a relationship with David that I almost erased all the ways Dad was already there for me. David and Sarah still keep in touch, but it's different now. They meet for coffee once a month, when he's in Boston for photography assignments. Their conversations stay light, focused on shared interests rather than obligations or expectations. David has stopped introducing her as his long-lost daughter and just calls her Sarah, a small change that somehow feels right. Watching Sarah work through the monthly budget with her financial counselor yesterday, I realized something. The inheritance was never really about the money. It was about trust, value, and family. Sarah finally understands that too. As she said to me over coffee this morning, I thought getting a bigger share of the inheritance would prove Dad loved me as much as you. Now I realize I was measuring the wrong thing all along. Looking out my office window at the Boston skyline, I can see the Sullivan Real Estate Development sign on one of our buildings. The company Dad built, that I'll continue to build. But more importantly, I can see our family's reflection in the glass. Not perfect, not unbroken, but whole in its own way. Sarah and I have both learned that sometimes you have to lose your way to find your way back home.